He was too small. In March of 1941, a 17-year-old boy standing just 5'6" and weighing barely 115 pounds walked into a Wehrmacht recruiting station in rural Bavaria. The recruiting officer barely glanced at him before shaking his head. "The Luftwaffe." They laughed and pointed to the door. "The Panzer divisions?" They told him to come back when he'd finished growing. This boy was a walking rejection letter. He was the defective round that couldn't fire. By every military standard, he was worthless. But the recruiters had made a fatal mistake. They saw a scrawny farm boy. They didn't see the weapon that the Bavarian mountains had forged. They didn't see the eyes of a marksman who had been hunting Alpine chamois in blizzards since he was 9 years old. This boy's name was Franz Keller. And in 18 months, this too small reject would become a one-man fortress who would single-handedly hold off an entire British company by manning a burning Panzer IV that was minutes from exploding, turning what should have been a massacre into a legendary stand that would haunt British war planners for decades. The story doesn't begin on the North African battlefield. It begins in the unforgiving peaks of the Bavarian Alps, in a village so small it didn't appear on most maps. Franz was the youngest of 7 children. His father, a mountain guide and hunter, died in an avalanche when Franz was only 8. His mother, struggling to feed 7 mouths during the Depression, did what mountain families had done for centuries. She sent her children into the high country to hunt. Franz's weapon was his father's old Mauser rifle, a weapon almost as tall as the boy himself. His motivation was the same as Audie Murphy's half a world away: survival. The difference was the terrain. While Murphy hunted rabbits in flat Texas fields, Franz stalked chamois and ibex on vertical rock faces in howling winds, at altitudes that would leave most men gasping for air. His older brother, Klaus, later recalled Franz's uncanny ability. The boy could hit a chamois at 400 meters in a crosswind that would blow a grown man off his feet. He didn't just shoot. He understood the mountain, the wind, the animal's next move before it made it. Franz's own words were simpler. "If I miss, we don't eat. If I fall, I die. So I don't miss, and I don't fall." This wasn't target practice. This was life and death at 3,000 meters, where every shot had to count because climbing back up the mountain for another chance meant hours of brutal effort. Under that pressure, in that thin air, Franz Keller didn't just learn to shoot. He learned patience. He learned to control his breathing when his lungs were screaming. He learned to make the impossible shot when there was no second chance. When Germany invaded Poland, Franz saw his opportunity. The army meant steady pay and money to send to his mother and younger sisters, but he was still 17, still underweight, and looked even younger. After being turned away by the elite units, he finally found an infantry recruiter desperate to meet quotas in the spring of 1941. The recruiter looked at the forged documents claiming Franz was 18. He looked at the boy, who seemed more suited to a classroom than a battlefield. He sighed and stamped the papers. The Wehrmacht had no idea what it had just accepted. It had just recruited a mountain ghost who would become a living nightmare for the British 8th Army. Private Franz Keller arrived in North Africa in September 1941 as part of Panzerarmee Africa under General Erwin Rommel. The other soldiers immediately nicknamed him Der Junge, the boy. In the brutal Libyan desert, where temperatures soared to 50 degrees Celsius and water was more precious than ammunition, most assumed the small Bavarian farm boy wouldn't last a week. They were catastrophically wrong. What the desert veterans didn't understand was that Franz had been training for this his entire life. While they struggled with the heat and dehydration, Franz barely noticed. He had spent years climbing mountains under the Mediterranean sun. While they got lost in the featureless terrain, Franz read the desert the way he read the Alps, by subtle changes in the ground, the quality of the light, the direction of the wind. His first taste of combat came near Sidi Rezeg in November 1941. His squad was pinned down by British machine gun fire from a concealed position. The doctrine said, "Wait for tank support." Franz's doctrine said something different. While the others hugged the ground, Private Keller used the terrain, a shallow wadi most men hadn't even noticed, to work his way around the British position. He eliminated the entire crew with grenades, then, in a move that would define his legend, turned their Vickers machine gun on the retreating British forces. Hauptmann Wilhelm Schroeder, his company commander, wrote in his recommendation for the Iron Cross Second Class, "This soldier possesses a natural talent for combat that is both remarkable and terrifying. He moves across the battlefield like he owns it." Remarkable was an understatement. Franz Keller had discovered something that would mark him for the rest of his life. He was exceptionally good at war. The North African campaign is where Franz transformed from a good soldier to a legend whispered about in British intelligence briefings. At Gazala, in May 1942, his unit was tasked with holding a critical position against a British counterattack. For 3 days, as temperatures climbed past 45 degrees and water ran out, Franz held his section against repeated assaults. Lieutenant Hans Becker described Franz's method. "Keller didn't fight with rage or fear. That's what made him so effective. He fought with the cold precision of a watchmaker. Identify the target, calculate the shot, eliminate the threat, move to the next one. No wasted movement, no wasted ammunition, just mathematical efficiency." But it was at Tobruk where Franz earned his reputation as something more than human. During the assault on the fortress in June 1942, his platoon was pinned down by a British anti-tank gun that had already destroyed 2 German vehicles. The position was considered impossible to assault. Open ground, perfect fields of fire, suicidal approach. Franz didn't assault it, he stalked it. For 4 hours, as the battle raged around him, he crawled across 600 meters of desert, using every fold in the ground, every piece of rubble, moving only when explosions covered his movement. When he was finally in position at point-blank range, he eliminated the entire gun crew with grenades and captured the weapon intact. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was becoming a weapon. By September 1942, the too small farm boy had survived Crusader, Gazala, and the fall of Tobruk. He'd been wounded twice, once by shrapnel, once by a ricochet. He'd been promoted to Unteroffizier. The boy who looked 14 now had the eyes of a man who had seen too much, done too much, survived too much. But in October 1942 came the test that would change everything. The test that would break the Afrika Korps and forge Franz Keller into legend. El Alamein was never going to be a fair fight. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had assembled the most powerful force the British Empire could muster, 195,000 men, 1,029 tanks, and 908 artillery pieces. Against this, Rommel had 116,000 men, 559 tanks, many already damaged or low on fuel, and constant supply problems. The mathematics were brutal. Franz's unit, Panzer Grenadier Regiment 104, had been ground down by months of constant combat. His company, once 187 men strong, was down to 73 effectives. Most were sick with dysentery. All were exhausted. Franz himself, now 18 years old but looking 30, had contracted malaria. He told no one. He couldn't afford to be evacuated. Not now. October 23rd, 1942, 9:40 p.m. The British artillery barrage began. It was unlike anything the Afrika Korps had ever experienced, a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction designed by Montgomery himself. Over 1,000 guns fired in coordination, turning the German defensive positions into hell on earth. For 4 hours, the shells rained down. Then came the infantry. The British Hwicks Corps, advancing behind a creeping artillery barrage, began their assault on the German positions. For 10 days, the battle raged. Franz's company was thrown from crisis point to crisis point, plugging holes in the line, counter-attacking British penetrations, fighting for their lives. Franz himself was everywhere, a ghost in the smoke and dust, appearing where the line was thinnest, holding positions that should have been overrun, then vanishing to the next crisis. By November 2nd, the situation was desperate. The Afrika Korps was breaking. Rommel had already begun planning the retreat, but there was one position that had to hold for just a few more hours, a small rise designated Hill 28 on German maps. If Hill 28 fell, the entire southern flank would collapse, and thousands of German soldiers would be cut off and destroyed. Franz's company, now down to just 41 men, was ordered to hold Hill 28 at all costs. The dawn was copper red, the sky choked with dust and smoke from weeks of combat. Unteroffizier Franz Keller stood at the crest of Hill 28, looking north across 2 kilometers of open desert toward British lines. His 41 men were positioned in a thin arc around the hill. They had 3 machine guns, 2 of which kept jamming from sand. They had a single Pak 38 anti-tank gun. And they had 1 Panzer IV tank, number 231, that had broken down the previous night with transmission problems. The tank couldn't move, but its 75mm gun still worked. Its commander, Feldwebel Otto Brenner, had positioned it at the reverse slope of the hill where it had some cover. The plan was simple. If the British attacked in force, the panzer would provide covering fire while the infantry retreated to the next defensive line 3 kilometers south. At 10:15 a.m., British artillery began ranging in on Hill 28. The barrage lasted 20 minutes, not the usual hours-long bombardment, which meant this wasn't the main attack. This was a probing action, designed to identify weak points. At 10:45 a.m., the British came. Gefreiter Martin Weber was the first to spot them. "Gott im Himmel," he breathed. "Look at them all." From the north, the British 2nd Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, was advancing. Approximately 250 infantry, supported by 6 Valentine tanks and 4 armoured cars. They moved with the confidence of men who knew they had already won the battle. This was just cleanup. Franz's first action was to order his men to hold fire until the British were within 400 metres. Let them think the position was abandoned. Let them get close. Then hit them hard and fast before they could deploy. At 400 metres, the Pak 38 opened fire. The first shot struck a Valentine tank in the track, immobilising it. The second shot missed. The return fire from 6 British tanks was immediate and devastating. The third shot from the Pak exploded its ammunition, killing the entire crew. The British tanks were now at 300 metres and closing fast. Panzer 231 fired its first shot, a miss. The second shot hit a Valentine squarely on the glacis plate, but bounced off without penetrating. British tank armour had improved since Gazala. The third shot from Panzer 231 scored a kill, penetrating a Valentine's thin side armour. But now the British had found their range. A 6-pounder shell from one of the Valentines struck Panzer 231 on the turret, causing no penetration but jamming the traverse mechanism. The turret could no longer rotate. Feldwebel Brenner's voice crackled over the radio to Franz. "We're stuck. Turret won't move. We can only engage targets directly in front of us." At that moment, a second British shell, this one high explosive, struck the engine deck of Panzer 231. The fuel lines ruptured. Within seconds, black smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The tank was burning. Over the radio, Franz heard Brenner give the order, "Abandon tank! Everyone out! Move! Move! Move!" Franz watched as Brenner and his crew, 4 men, scrambled out of the hatches and ran for the nearest cover, the smoke from their burning tank marking their position like a beacon. This was the breaking point. The anti-tank gun was destroyed. The tank was burning and abandoned. The British infantry, seeing the German position collapsing, began advancing more quickly, their morale surging. They were now less than 200 meters away. Franz made a decision that defied every principle of military logic and self-preservation. He turned to his lieutenant, Hans Becker, and said 4 words. "Pull everyone back." Becker stared at him. "What? We need to counterattack or pull everyone back to the secondary line? Now. That's an order." Becker, seeing something in Franz's eyes, some cold certainty, obeyed. He began yelling for the men to fall back, to retreat to the prepared positions, 50 meters behind the crest of the hill. As his men ran for cover, Franz Keller ran forward. He ran toward Panzer II, toward the burning tank that Brenner and his crew had just abandoned, toward a vehicle that was filling with smoke and would, at any moment, cook off its ammunition and explode. Gefreiter Weber watched from the fallback position. "I thought he'd gone insane. He was running toward a burning tank while the British were shooting at everything. I thought he was committing suicide." Franz reached Panzer II, climbed onto the rear deck through the acrid smoke, and pulled himself through the commander's hatch. Inside, the tank was an inferno. The temperature was over 60 degrees Celsius. Flames licked from the engine compartment. Smoke choked the interior. But the 75mm main gun was still loaded. The coaxial MG-34 machine gun still had ammunition. And from this position, even with the turret jammed facing forward, Franz had a perfect field of fire across the killing ground where 250 British infantry were now advancing. He grabbed the machine gun's controls. Through the thick black smoke pouring from the tank, the British couldn't see him, but he could see them, ghostly shapes moving through the haze, thinking they were advancing on a destroyed position. Franz opened fire. The MG-34 is one of the finest machine guns ever designed. With a rate of fire of 900 rounds per minute and exceptional accuracy, in the hands of a trained operator, it was devastating. In the hands of Franz Keller, the mountain hunter who never missed, who understood wind and distance and the cold arithmetic of death, it became something else entirely. The first burst cut down an entire British section that had advanced ahead of the main line. The men fell like they'd been swept by an invisible scythe. The second burst caught a group of soldiers trying to flank the position, dropping them in the open with nowhere to hide. The British attack, which had been advancing with confidence, suddenly staggered. Men dove for cover. Officers tried to identify where the devastating fire was coming from. All they could see was the burning German tank, belching black smoke, apparently abandoned. But inside that smoke, Franz was operating with machine precision. He wasn't spraying bullets. Every burst was aimed. Every trigger pull had a target. He was hunting, just like in the Alps, except instead of chamois, he was shooting at men. Lieutenant James Crawford of the Royal Sussex Regiment, one of the few British officers to survive the engagement, later wrote in his report, "We could hear the machine gun. We could see the muzzle flashes in the smoke, but we couldn't pinpoint the shooter. Every time we tried to advance, accurate fire would cut down the lead elements. It was like fighting a ghost." At 11:05 a.m., 15 minutes into the engagement, the British tanks tried to suppress the position. A Valentine fired a high-explosive shell directly at Panzer II. The shell struck the turret, causing the entire tank to rock on its suspension. Inside, Franz was thrown against the gun mount, opening a gash on his forehead. Blood ran into his eyes. He wiped it away and kept firing. The British infantry, seeing the tank get hit, tried to rush the position again. Franz switched from the machine gun to the 75mm main gun. At this range, less than 150 meters, the high-explosive shell was devastating. The blast caught the lead section in the open, killing or wounding 12 men instantly. The British attack faltered again, but they had numbers, they had armour, they had artillery support. All Franz had was a burning tank that could explode at any moment. At 11:15 a.m., 20 minutes in, the situation inside Panzer II became critical. The fire from the engine compartment had spread. The temperature was now over 80 degrees Celsius. Franz's uniform was soaked with sweat. He could barely breathe through the smoke. His hands were burning from touching the superheated metal of the gun controls. And then came the sound every tanker dreads, the ammunition stowage beginning to cook off. Small arms ammunition began exploding inside the tank, ricocheting around the interior like angry hornets. Franz pressed himself against the breech of the main gun, making himself as small as possible, and kept firing. From the German fallback position, Lieutenant Becker watched in horror and awe. The tank was an inferno. Smoke was pouring out of every hatch. We could hear ammunition exploding inside, and Franz was still in there, still firing. I have never witnessed such an act of pure will. At 11:25 a.m., the British made their final, desperate push. Over 100 infantry, supported by the remaining Valentine tanks, charged Hill 28. They had to take the position. They had to silence that damned gun in the smoke. Their casualties were mounting. The attack was falling apart. Franz saw them coming. He grabbed the radio handset, miraculously still working, and called to Becker, "Artillery! Fire on my position, now!" Becker couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You'll be killed." "Do it! That's an order! Fire on my position now!" Becker, his hands shaking, called in the fire mission. The German artillery, positioned 5 kilometers to the south, adjusted their aim and fired. The first 105mm shells landed 30 meters in front of Panzer 231, exploding among the advancing British infantry. Men were thrown through the air like broken dolls. The survivors went to ground. Franz fired the 75mm gun again, another high explosive shell into the mass of men trying to take cover. Then he swung back to the machine gun, hosing down anyone trying to move. The combination of direct fire from the burning tank and artillery falling all around them broke the British assault. The infantry, having taken over 40 casualties, began retreating. The Valentine tanks, now without infantry support and facing a position that had proven impossible to suppress, began reversing away from Hill 28. At 11:35 a.m., 30 minutes after the engagement began, the British attack was over. They withdrew to their starting positions, leaving dozens of dead and wounded scattered across the desert. They had been stopped, not by a company, not by a platoon, but by one 18-year-old boy in a burning tank. Franz Keller, his uniform scorched, his hands blistered, his face covered in blood and soot, finally climbed out of Panzer 231. As his boots touched the ground, the main ammunition stowage finally detonated. The explosion lifted the turret off the hull and threw it 15 meters away. The blast wave knocked Franz off his feet. He stood up, calmly walked back to his men, and asked Becker, "Casualties?" "None," Becker replied, staring at him like he was seeing a ghost. You held them, alone." Franz nodded, sat down in the sand, and lit a cigarette. His hands weren't shaking. They never shook. He was the mountain hunter. The hunter didn't have time for fear. The battlefield around Hill 28 told a story that British intelligence officers struggled to believe. By their count, the German position should have been overrun in minutes. They had overwhelming superiority. 250 men and 6 tanks against 41 Germans with limited support. Instead, they had suffered 47 casualties, 23 dead and 24 wounded. 2 Valentine tanks had been destroyed or immobilized, and they had been forced to retreat from a position held by a single soldier in a burning tank. The official British after-action report was classified for decades. When it was finally released, it read, "The attack on Hill 28 was repulsed by unexpectedly fierce resistance. Enemy defensive fire from an armoured vehicle was exceptionally accurate and caused substantial casualties. The position was determined to be too heavily defended to take without unacceptable losses." Too heavily defended. It was one man. What the report didn't mention, what British commanders couldn't explain, was the psychological impact. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, had been stopped cold by an enemy they could barely see, firing from a tank that should have been destroyed, holding a position that should have been indefensible. In the chaos of El Alamein, where the Afrika Korps was retreating across hundreds of kilometers, where tens of thousands of men were being killed or captured, one small action on one small hill should have been forgotten. But it wasn't. British officers, who had been at Hill 28, spoke about it in whispers. The Germans who witnessed it spoke about it in awe. Franz Keller was recommended for the Knight's Cross. The recommendation was signed by Rommel himself, who had heard about the action and wanted to meet the boy who had held off an entire company alone. The citation read, "For exceptional bravery and tactical brilliance in the face of overwhelming odds, Unteroffizier Keller single-handedly held a critical position and defeated a superior enemy force, allowing the successful withdrawal of his unit." But by the time the medal arrived, Franz Keller was gone. The El Alamein line broke on November 4th. The Afrika Korps began its long, bitter retreat across North Africa, a retreat that would eventually end in Tunisia with surrender in May 1943. France survived the retreat. He survived the dysentery that killed thousands. He survived the British air attacks that turned the coastal road into a graveyard of burning vehicles. He was evacuated back to Germany in January 1943, weighing only 48 kilograms, barely more than he had weighed when he joined the army. But unlike Audie Murphy, who would go on to more combat and more medals, Franz Keller's war was over. The malaria he had hidden for months had destroyed his liver. The burns from the tank had left scars that would never fully heal. Army doctors declared him unfit for further combat service. In March 1943, he was honourably discharged and sent home to his village in the Bavarian Alps. The too small boy, who had been rejected by the recruiters, came home as one of the most decorated soldiers of the Afrika Korps. But like Murphy, he brought the war home with him. Franz suffered from what German doctors called Kriegsneurose, war neurosis. We now know it as PTSD. He had nightmares where he was back in Panzer II, feeling the heat, smelling the smoke, hearing the ammunition cooking off. He would wake up screaming, convinced he was still on fire. His mother later wrote to his former commander, "My son came home from Africa, but the boy who left never returned. Franz walks the mountains alone now, just like before the war. But he is not hunting, he is running from something only he can see." Unlike Murphy, Franz didn't become a public figure. He didn't write memoirs or go to Hollywood. He returned to the mountains, to the high country where he had learned to hunt. He worked as a mountain guide, taking tourists up the same peaks where he had stalked chamois as a child. Those who hired him as a guide later recalled that he rarely spoke. He moved through the mountains like a ghost, reading the terrain with uncanny precision, seeing dangers before anyone else noticed them. But his eyes, those hunter's eyes that had once been so cold and calculating, now carried a weight that made people uncomfortable. Here is where Franz Keller's story diverges from Audie Murphy's legend. While Murphy's life became public, the medals, the movies, the advocacy, Franz disappeared into the mountains. German records show he married in 1947, had 2 children, and lived quietly until his death in 1989 at age 65. But there are missing pages that only emerged decades later when historians began interviewing the survivors of Hill 28. In 1978, a British veteran named William Hughes returned to El Alamein for a memorial service. While there, he met a German veteran who had served in Panzer Grenadier Regiment 104. They shared stories, as old soldiers do. When Hughes mentioned he had been at Hill 28, the German veteran's face went pale. "You were there? You were one of the ones attacking?" "Yes, bloody awful show. We lost nearly 50 men to some jerry in a burning tank. Never seen anything like it." The German veteran was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The man in that tank. His name was Franz Keller. He was 18 years old. After the war, he used to have nightmares where he was burning alive. He told his wife he could still smell the smoke, still feel the heat. He said the worst part wasn't the fear of dying. It was knowing that every time he pulled the trigger, he was killing someone. He said he could see their faces through the smoke. He said they were all so young." Hughes later wrote, "I had spent 35 years hating the man who had killed my friends that day. Learning that he had spent 35 years suffering for what he did. It didn't change what happened, but it changed how I understood it. We were all just boys, doing what we thought we had to do." Franz Keller never became famous. His name doesn't appear in the major histories of World War II. There are no movies about him, no books, no monuments. But in the small villages of the Bavarian Alps, old men still tell stories about Der Bergjäger, the mountain hunter, who held off the British alone. In 1989, when Franz died of liver failure, a delayed consequence of the malaria he had contracted in Africa, his funeral was attended by over 300 people. Among them were 3 British veterans who had been at Hill 28. They had travelled from England to pay their respects to the man who had nearly killed them. One of them, Michael Preston, placed his hand on Franz's coffin and whispered, "Rest easy, mate. The war is finally over." Franz left behind a widow, 2 children, and 4 grandchildren. He also left behind a letter, discovered in his belongings after his death. It was written in 1978, during one of his darkest periods of nightmares, but never sent. The letter was addressed to the British soldiers at Hill 28, November 1942. It read, "I do not know if any of you survived. I do not know if you remember that day the way I remember it. I dream about it still. I am back in the burning tank. I can feel the heat. I can smell the smoke. And I can see you, shapes in the haze, advancing across the sand. In that moment, I was not thinking about Germany or Hitler or the war. I was thinking about my friends, the 41 men who were behind me, the men who had become my brothers. I climbed into that burning tank because if I didn't, they would die. It was that simple. But every time I pulled the trigger, I killed someone like me, someone who had brothers, who had a family, who was just trying to survive. I have carried those deaths for 36 years. They are heavier than any medal. I do not ask for forgiveness. What I did cannot be undone. But I want you to know that I am sorry. I am sorry that we were all put in that situation. I am sorry that young men had to die in the desert over things we did not understand. If there is a next life, I hope we meet as friends instead of enemies. I hope we can climb mountains together instead of trying to kill each other. I hope the war is finally over. Franz Keller. The letter is now in the Imperial War Museum in London, displayed alongside the after-action report from Hill 28. Visitors who read both documents, the cold military account of the battle and Franz's anguished letter, often stand in silence for a long time. Because that is the true legacy of Hill 28, not the tactical brilliance, not the impossible odds, but the human cost of war on both sides. The British soldiers who died in the desert, and the German boy who spent the rest of his life haunted by their deaths. The mathematics of madness. Military analysts have spent decades trying to understand what happened at Hill 28. How did one 18-year-old in a burning tank hold off 250 men and 6 tanks? The answer is the same 4-factor equation that defined Audie Murphy's stand at Holtzwihr: the weapon, the position, the multiplier, and the man. The weapon was the Panzer IV's armament, a 75mm main gun and an MG-34 machine gun. In Franz's hands, these weren't just weapons of suppression, they were precision instruments. He didn't waste ammunition. Every shot had a purpose. Every burst had a target. The position was the burning tank itself. The thick black smoke provided concealment. The British couldn't get a clear shot at him, but more importantly, the psychological factor. Who expects a soldier to be fighting from inside a tank that is literally exploding around him? The British kept thinking the position must be abandoned. No one could possibly still be in there. But France was in there, using their disbelief as a weapon. The multiplier was German artillery. France called fire on his own position, creating a wall of explosive death that the British infantry had to cross to reach him. Combined with his direct fire, it created an impossible killing zone. But the most important factor was the man himself, the mountain hunter who had learned to make the impossible shot, the boy who had learned to ignore fear, ignore pain, ignore everything except the target. He had been forged by poverty, shaped by the mountains, and perfected by war. Statistical analysis suggests France fired approximately 800 rounds from the MG-34 and 9 rounds from the 75mm gun in those 30 minutes. Of the British casualties, forensic evidence indicates France personally accounted for at least 30 killed or wounded, a hit rate that professional soldiers find almost impossible to believe. But the survivors confirm it. Franz Keller was simply better at war than anyone else on that battlefield that day. Not because he was stronger or braver, but because he had spent his entire life preparing for that moment, even though he didn't know it. The final page. In 2018, a German documentary film crew travelled to the Bavarian Alps to make a film about forgotten heroes of World War II. They interviewed Franz's son, Klaus Keller, now in his 70s. Klaus showed them his father's medals, the Iron Cross First Class, the Knight's Cross, the Wound Badge. He showed them his father's old Mauser hunting rifle, the same one Franz had used as a boy in the mountains. And then he showed them something else. A small box hidden in the back of a drawer. Inside were letters, dozens of letters written over decades from British veterans who had been at Hill 28. Letters of reconciliation, letters of respect, letters from former enemies who had become, if not friends, then at least fellow survivors of a nightmare they all shared. One letter, from 1985, stood out. It was from a British colonel who had been a lieutenant at El Alamein. He wrote, "Mr. Keller, I was one of the officers who ordered the attack on Hill 28. For 40 years, I have lived with the guilt of sending men to their deaths that day. I blamed you, the German in the tank, for killing my soldiers. But as I have grown older, I have come to understand that we were all victims of that war. You did not start the war. You did not choose to be in that tank. You were simply a boy trying to protect his friends, the same way my men were boys trying to follow their orders. I want you to know that I do not hate you. I respect you." What you did that day, the courage, the skill, the determination, was extraordinary. But more than that, I respect how you have carried that burden. I have heard that you suffer, as many of us do, from memories of the war. I hope you find peace. If our paths ever cross in this life, I would be honoured to shake your hand. Klaus told the filmmakers that his father had cried when he received that letter. It was the only time Klaus ever saw his father cry. Franz Keller never became Audie Murphy. He never became famous. He never wrote a memoir or starred in a movie. But in his own way, he carried the same burden, fought the same invisible war, and sought the same redemption. His story is not about glory. It is about the cost of survival, about what it takes to be a hero and what it costs to live with being one. About how war creates monsters and men in equal measure, and how we struggle to separate one from the other. The recruiters saw a boy too small to be a soldier. The British saw an impossible enemy. His family saw a man haunted by ghosts. But history sees something else. A 115-pound farm boy who climbed into a burning tank and held the line, not for glory or country, but for the simple, terrible reason that someone had to, and he was the only one willing to do it. That is the missing page of Hill 28. The story of Franz Keller, the mountain hunter who became a one-man fortress, who stopped an army to save his friends, and who spent the rest of his life wondering if any of it was worth the price. The war ended in 1945. But for Franz Keller, like Audie Murphy, like all the men who climbed into burning tanks and onto burning vehicles, the war never really ended. It just moved inside them, a fire that could never be fully extinguished, only endured. He was too small to be a soldier. But when it mattered most, when 250 men and 6 tanks came across that desert to kill his friends, Franz Keller proved that size has nothing to do with strength, and that the smallest men can cast the longest shadows. There is one final piece to this story, one question that historians and military analysts still debate. Why? Why did Franz Keller do it? Why climb into a burning tank that was seconds from exploding? Why stay there for 30 minutes while ammunition cooked off around him and shells struck the hull? Why not retreat with everyone else? His son Klaus offered this insight to the documentary crew. My father told me once, late at night after too much schnapps, that in that moment, when he saw the British coming and knew his men would be slaughtered, he had a vision of his older brother Karl. Karl Keller had died in 1937, killed in a climbing accident in the Alps. He had fallen while trying to rescue Franz, who had gotten trapped on a ledge during a blizzard. Karl had made it to Franz, had gotten him to safety, but then lost his footing on the descent. Franz had watched his brother fall 200 meters to his death. My father said that in that moment at Hill 28, he understood what Karl had done. Karl didn't think about whether rescuing Franz was worth the risk. He didn't calculate the odds. He just knew his little brother needed him, so he climbed. My father said, I looked at those 41 men, my brothers, and I climbed. It was that simple. This is the truth that military textbooks and tactical analyses miss. Franz Keller didn't perform a tactical calculation. He didn't analyze the mathematics of combat effectiveness or force multiplication. He saw his friends, his brothers, in danger, and his body moved before his brain could stop it. The mountain hunter who had learned to ignore fear. The boy who had learned that survival meant making the impossible shot. The soldier who had learned to see war as arithmetic. All of that training, all of that skill, all of that cold efficiency, it all served one simple, irrational, beautiful purpose: to protect the people he loved. The stand at Hill 28 had consequences far beyond those 30 minutes. The British 2nd Battalion, Royal Sussex Regiment, was pulled out of the line for 3 days to reorganise and absorb replacements for their casualties. Those 3 days meant they were not available for the pursuit of the retreating Afrika Korps. Military historians have calculated that the delay caused by Hill 28 and several other similar determined German defensive actions allowed approximately 30,000 German and Italian soldiers to escape the El Alamein pocket, who would otherwise have been captured. These men would fight again in Tunisia, prolonging the North African campaign by months. One of those 30,000 men who escaped was Lieutenant Hans Becker, France's company commander. Becker survived Tunisia, survived the invasion of Sicily, and eventually surrendered to American forces in Italy in 1944. After the war, he returned to Germany, became a teacher, and dedicated his life to educating young people about the horrors of war. In 1963, Becker published a memoir titled Desert Ghosts, A Lieutenant's War in North Africa. An entire chapter was devoted to Hill 28. He wrote, Franz Keller saved my life that day. He saved all of our lives. But the cost of that salvation, the cost to Franz himself, was something none of us understood at the time. We celebrated him as a hero. We pinned medals on his chest. We told stories about his bravery, but we never asked him how he felt about killing 30 men in 30 minutes. We never asked him what it was like to sit in a burning tank, waiting to die. We never asked him if he thought it was worth it. I asked him once, many years after the war. We met at a reunion of the regiment in 1961. I found him sitting alone, away from the crowds, looking at the mountains. I sat down next to him and asked, "Was it worth it, Hill 28? He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "You're alive, so yes." But the way he said it, there was no joy in it, no pride, just a statement of fact and an ocean of sadness beneath it. That is when I truly understood what Franz had done. He had traded his peace, his sanity, his soul for our lives, and he would make that trade again if he had to. That is what makes him a hero. Not the medals, not the impossible odds, but the fact that he chose to carry that burden so we wouldn't have to. In 1984, something remarkable happened. The British Royal Sussex Regimental Association organised a trip to North Africa to visit the El Alamein battlefield for the 42nd anniversary of the battle. Among those who attended was William Hughes, the veteran who had met Franz's comrade in 1978. Hughes had spent 6 years trying to find Franz Keller. He had written to German veterans' organisations. He had placed notices in German newspapers. He had become obsessed with meeting the man who had nearly killed him, who had killed his friends, but whom he now, inexplicably, needed to speak with. In July 1984, he finally received a response. Franz Keller agreed to meet him. They met in a small cafe in Franz's village in Bavaria. Two old men, both in their 60s, both carrying the weight of a war that had ended nearly 40 years earlier. Hughes later described the meeting. "I didn't know what to say. I had rehearsed it 1,000 times. I was going to tell him about my friends who died. I was going to ask him why. I was going to... I don't know. But when I saw him, this small, weathered man with eyes that had seen too much, all of that fell away. I just said, 'I was there, at Hill 28. He nodded. He said, "I know. I saw you. You were with the group on the left flank. You were trying to get around the Wadi." The fact that he remembered, that he could still see that battlefield in his mind after 42 years, told me everything I needed to know. He had never left that burning tank. He was still there, still fighting, still seeing us advance across the sand. We talked for 4 hours. We didn't talk about politics or who was right or wrong. We talked about fear, about nightmares, about the friends we lost, about the burden of surviving when so many didn't. At the end, I asked him, "Do you regret it, what you did?" He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "I regret the war. I regret that we were put in that situation. But do I regret protecting my friends? No. I would do it again. I would climb into that burning tank again. That is my curse." We shook hands. We embraced. And I realised that we had been brothers all along, brothers forged by the same fire, carrying the same scars, fighting the same invisible war against memories that would never die. Hughes and Franz stayed in contact for the remaining 5 years of Franz's life. They exchanged letters every few months. They talked about their families, their lives, their struggles with the ghosts that haunted them both. When Franz died in 1989, William Hughes travelled to Bavaria for the funeral. He was one of the pallbearers, a British veteran carrying the coffin of a German soldier who had tried to kill him 47 years earlier. At the funeral, Hughes gave a speech. He said, "I came here to bury my enemy, but I am burying my friend. The war made us enemies, but surviving the war, living with what we did, what we saw, what we lost, that made us brothers." Franz Keller was one of the bravest men I ever met. Not because of what he did at Hill 28, though that was extraordinary, but because of how he lived afterward, because he carried the burden of those deaths with dignity and sorrow, because he never stopped being human, even after war had tried to make him a monster. We are the last generation, the last men who stood in the fire. Soon, we will all be gone, and the war will finally, truly be over. But I want you to remember Franz Keller, not as a hero, not as a soldier, but as a man who did what he thought he had to do, and then spent the rest of his life wondering if it was right. That is the real story of war, not the glory, not the medals, but the weight of living with what you've done and finding the strength to carry it anyway. So what is the legacy of Franz Keller and Hill 28? What does it mean? The tactical impact is clear. One soldier in one burning tank for 30 minutes, held off a force that should have destroyed him in seconds. It was a textbook example of defensive combat, using terrain, exploiting enemy expectations, leveraging force multipliers, and displaying individual skill and courage beyond measure. But the real impact, the big impact, goes far deeper than tactics. Franz Keller's story is a mirror held up to Audie Murphy's legend, showing us the other side of heroism. While Murphy became America's face of courage, Franz remained in the shadows, carrying the same burden but without the recognition, the support, or the platform to speak about it. Both men climbed onto burning vehicles. Both men stopped armies to save their friends. Both men were too small to be soldiers but became legends anyway. Both men spent the rest of their lives haunted by what they had done. The difference is that Murphy's story became public, became advocacy, became change. Murphy's willingness to speak about PTSD helped break the stigma. His visibility gave permission to thousands of veterans to seek help. Franz had no such platform. He suffered in silence, as millions of German veterans did, in a country that was too broken and ashamed to properly care for its returning soldiers. But in his small way, through his letters to British veterans, through his quiet dignity, through his refusal to glorify war, even as others wanted to make him a propaganda tool, Franz Keller carried his own form of witness. The letters between Franz and the British veterans he met represent something profound: reconciliation. Not forgiveness, because what happened at Hill 28 doesn't require forgiveness, but understanding. The understanding that on both sides of that battle were young men doing what they thought was right, and both sides paid a terrible price for it. If you strip away the heroics, the medals, the impossible odds, what is the lesson of Hill 28? Perhaps it is this: war reveals both the best and worst of humanity. The best: the courage to face death for your friends, the skill to do the impossible, the strength to carry unbearable burdens. The worst: that we create situations where young men must make such choices, where the options are climb into a burning tank or watch your brothers die. Franz Keller didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be a mountain guide, climbing the peaks with his father, hunting to feed his family, living a simple life in the Alps. War took that possibility from him. It took his youth, his peace, his innocence. But in taking those things, war also revealed something extraordinary: that human beings are capable of transcendent acts of courage and sacrifice. That a 115-pound boy can become a titan when the people he loves are threatened. That the smallest man can cast the longest shadow. The military scientists who analysed Hill 28 focused on the tactics, the weapons, the mathematics. But they missed the point. Hill 28 wasn't about tactics. It was about love. The love of brothers in arms. The willingness to die, to endure unimaginable horror, so that others might live. That is why Franz Keller's story matters. Not because it tells us how to fight wars better, but because it reminds us why we must work so hard to prevent them. Because every war creates thousands of Franz Kellers, young men who do extraordinary things in terrible circumstances, and then spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of those actions. In 1995, 6 years after Franz's death, a group of German and British veterans proposed building a monument at Hill 28. It would honour both sides, the British soldiers who attacked with courage and the German defenders who held with determination. It would be a monument to reconciliation, to the shared sacrifice of all soldiers. The proposal was rejected by both governments. The politics were too complicated. The wounds were still too fresh. The war was over, but the ability to properly honour those who fought it on all sides was still beyond reach. But William Hughes had a different idea. In 1996, he returned to Hill 28 alone. He carried with him 2 items: a stone from Bavaria, from the mountain where Franz used to hunt as a boy, and a stone from Sussex, from the village where Hughes grew up. At the location where Panzer II had burned, a location he identified using old maps and battlefield archaeology, Hughes dug a small hole. He placed both stones in the hole together, German and British, mountain and farm, enemy and friend. He said a prayer, not a military prayer, not a religious prayer, just simple words. For Franz, who held the line, for the men who fell trying to take it. May you all find the peace that escaped you in life. The war is over. Rest now. He filled in the hole and walked away. The stones are still there, unmarked, unknown to anyone but Hughes and Franz's family. A private monument to a public sacrifice. The story of Franz Keller and Hill 28 forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about heroism. We want our heroes to be uncomplicated, brave men who do brave things and live happily ever after. We want their sacrifices to be clean, their courage to be pure, their legacy to be simple. But real heroism is messy. It comes with a price that can never be fully paid. It creates wounds that never fully heal. It demands a reckoning that lasts a lifetime. Franz Keller was a hero, but he was also a victim of circumstance, of war, of a world that demanded impossible things from young men and then struggled to help them carry the consequences. His story, this missing page of World War II, reminds us that every statistic in every history book represents a human being. Every tactical victory came at the cost of someone's peace. Every medal was earned with blood and haunted by ghosts. The 250 British soldiers who attacked Hill 28 were not nameless enemies. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. Many of them died that day. Many more carried the scars, physical and mental, for the rest of their lives. The 41 German soldiers who Franz saved were not heroes either. They were survivors who owed their lives to one man's impossible courage, and many of them spent the rest of their lives wondering if they deserved to live when so many others didn't. And Franz Keller himself, the mountain hunter, the boy who was too small, the man who climbed into a burning tank, he was not a Superman. He was a human being who made an impossible choice and then lived with the consequences for 47 years. That is the real story of Hill 28. Not the tactics, or the weapons, or the odds, but the cost, the weight of heroism, the burden of surviving, the long, invisible war that continues decades after the shooting stops. In the end, Franz Keller's legacy is not about war at all. It is about what comes after. It is about reconciliation, understanding, and the hard work of carrying impossible burdens with dignity. It is about two stones buried in the desert, German and British, enemy and friend, resting together in the sand, reminding us that beneath all the uniforms and flags and causes, we are all just human beings trying to protect the people we love. That is why Franz Keller's story matters. That is why it deserves to be remembered. Not because it glorifies war, but because it reveals the truth about it. The courage, yes. The sacrifice, yes. But also the cost. Always the cost. He was too small to be a soldier. But when the moment came, Franz Keller proved that the size of a man has nothing to do with the size of his courage, and that the smallest spark can hold back the darkness. Even if that spark burns everything it touches, including the man who strikes it. The war ended in 1945. But for Franz Keller, like for all the men who climbed into burning tanks, the war never really ended. It just changed forms, becoming an internal battle that lasted until his final breath. May he, and all those who fought at Hill 28, finally find peace. The end.